Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. We are still live at Microsoft Ignite, and I am talking to, I forgot your name.
Oh, Aaron Gustafson.
Aaron Gustafson. This episode is brought to you by Triplebyte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume, you spend hours and hours on the phone screens, and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, Triplebyte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. Triplebyte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/JSJabber. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through Triplebyte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus. Aaron, do you want to say hi and introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Hi, I'm Aaron Gustafson, and gosh, I've been working on the web for 20 plus years. I'm editor-in-chief at A List Apart, which is one of our big industry publications. I work on the Edge team as an evangelist for web standards and for accessibility. And gosh, I've probably done just about every job that you can do on the web at this point, and I still love it. So.
Awesome. Now, A List Apart, you said that's one of our publications. So does Microsoft own that?
No, not Microsoft. Our communities.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been around pretty much since the beginning.
I was going to say, they've been around for a long time.
Yep. Yeah, I joined as, I've been on staff before as a technical editor, left for a while, and then came back as editor-in-chief. And I think I've been editor-in-chief for about a year and a half or so, maybe a little bit longer, which is fun. It's a nice side project to do.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought. I guess I just assumed that it was a kind of a commercial thing these days. But
it's pretty much all volunteer. So
wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't do ads or anything like that, and it's all focused on just community building.
Nice. You want to talk a little bit about your background in the web community, just some of the things that you've done and where you've been. You kind of gave me a thumbnail sketch beforehand, and I think it'd be interesting for people to hear. Yeah.
So, gosh, I taught myself how to do the web back around about 95 or 96. I still remember the first book I got. It was Creating and Enhancing Netscape Web Pages. And so I kind of taught myself how to do HTML and stuff back then. And of course, it was heavily presentational and crazy, lots of font elements and stuff like that, and tables for layout and such. And then... Yeah, my first job on the web, where people were actually handing over cash to me to do web stuff, I was the content management system for the Bradenton Herald in Bradenton, Florida. And so, and this was 99. XML was the future, and the Jelly IMAX had just come out. But I'd go into work at 11 o'clock at night, and I'd take articles out of the Quark documents, and I'd put them into Dreamweaver templates and fetch them up to the website.
Oh, wow.
I had all editorial control over what went up on the website because we didn't put every article up or anything like that. There was no actual content management system. It was pretty much just me, and I'd work from like 11 at night until about 6 or 7 in the morning producing the newspaper for the web, which was kind of nuts. But then relocated from Florida to Connecticut, worked for a bunch of companies like Deloitte & Touche and Gartner and stuff like that. Working with them, and caught the web standards bug around 2000, got really into CSS, and became involved with the Web Standards Project, with the World Organization of Webmasters. I've done some work with the W3C and stuff over the years, and it's been kind of a wild ride, and I've taught myself a ton and done just about everything I could possibly think to do at this point, but I still love it. It's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Now, when most people think about web standards, it's funny. I'll talk to people about web standards, and they're like, unless there's something in the standard they don't like.
Right.
So I'm a little curious. How does the sausage get made there?
Well, I mean, it depends on the organization.
Right.
And I would say it also depends a lot on what the spec is, where it originates. There's a lot of different ways that things come into being. It's kind of interesting to look back at sort of how HTML developed. Like, there are emails where Mark Andreessen basically said, I want to make the image element, and other people who were in kind of the early W3C were like, no, image element doesn't make sense. We need to have this generic object element. And so there's argument back and forth, but then Mark was like, I'm just going to ship it in NCSA Mosaic, and now we have the image element. And that's the way a lot of it was kind of in the early days.
Right.
And when standardization actually started happening, when we got kind of a unified DOM and we stopped having like specific style sheets for every browser out there and specific JavaScript files for every browser out there.
I have banged my head against that particular wall, yes.
Yeah. People don't know how good they have it nowadays. But everything started to kind of converge, and companies began working together better at the W3C, although there have been certainly meetings that I've been in where people have jumped over the table at each other.
Oh, really? Literally?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
It's funny. There's some characters in the W3C organizations. But everything's a little bit different. So now, like, you have some specs that emerge out of companies that are trying to scratch their own itches. I would say animations and transitions kind of coming out of Apple. That was something that was very much, they were trying to do that for their marketing stuff and for building things like Keynote Online and things like that. So that's where that originated, and then that became, it was kind of thrown over, and then there was some debate and some shifting. Similar things have happened with Grid. Grid came out of Microsoft years and years ago. It wasn't right for what we were trying to do, so that got discussed, and then eventually became the spec that it is now, and now has implementation across the board. Other things like responsive images came out of a community group. So that was something where a bunch of web developers said, hey, this is a problem we need to solve. And we got together and started working on potential solutions. Initially, there was the picture element, which was kind of borrowed a lot from video and audio elements. And eventually, we ended up with source set and sizes as well as alternate approaches. And so that kind of had, kind of like a grassroots building into becoming a spec. And so, there are some things that originated at the W3C, some originated at the browser or implementer level, and some come up from authors. And in fact, today, the Frontiers organization, which is a group of web designers and developers in the Netherlands, they just announced that at their next meeting, they're going to be voting on whether they become a W3C member advocating just for web designers and developers. And Rachel Andrew would actually be their first appointee to the W3C to act on web designers and developers' behalf. And that would be the first time that we would actually have a bought seat at the table. Because in many cases, it's been you're an invited expert to a particular committee, as opposed to being an actual member of the W3C that has a vote and stuff like that.
Oh, interesting. So, be interesting to follow.
Yeah. I'm hopeful that the vote will be in favor of, and we'll be able to get some folks on the W3C advocating for web designers and developers.
Yeah,
it would be nice.
It would be nice. So we set up this interview to talk about PWAs. And, it's definitely interesting to kind of get some of this background. Where did PWAs come from?
So PWAs, so the overall idea of a progressive web app is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of features of modern web design, basically. Like modern web design best practices, like being sort of network agnostic and having a richer app-like experience, being responsive, being secure, those sorts of things. There was that kind of initial laundry list that Alex Russell put together as things that he and Francis Berryman saw as characteristics of this new breed of website, effectively. And that's what they coined progressive web apps as kind of a marketing term. One of the underpinnings of that is the service worker spec, which came out of Google. And so they've obviously been big proponents of progressive web apps, and to the point that a lot of people began to think that PWAs were just a Google thing. But they just, because they came up with service worker and did some of the initial implementation stuff, they were the first to market with this idea and with the installability portion in Android. But, you've got Firefox can install PWAs on Android, Samsung can install PWAs on Android, Opera can. Chrome. In Windows, we have desktop PWAs. Chrome can install them on Windows and Mac OS. Firefox, I think, is working on installation for desktop as well.
Now, when you say install, what do you mean by that? So
the Chrome implementation, I feel like, is a little weird right now, but I think it's probably going to evolve over time. Like right now, it sort of becomes... I don't know really how to describe it other than like an orphaned app. Like it exists as, like when you launch it, it actually exists in the window list in Chrome, but it exists as its own app icon. And like if you're in that, like the Twitter PWA, if you've got that installed, it sits on its own. You can launch it on its own, all of that sort of stuff. But it's kind of like the old Chrome apps, if you remember those from back in the day. Whereas in Windows, you can actually install them from the Microsoft Store, and it's like fully its own app and has its own Edge instance and all of that sort of stuff. So it's a little bit different. But in the case of Chrome, you don't need to go through the go through an app store or anything like that. Edge is working on install from browser as well. I don't have an ETA on that, but there's sort of multiple ways to get to PWA installation and having it live as an app within your operating system.
Gotcha. So you still have to be able to connect to the web server and load everything up.
At least initially. Yeah. But I mean, the one of the huge benefits is file size. So if you looked at the UWP app that Twitter had, I don't remember the exact number, but it was somewhere around like 170 megs to download from the store. The Twitter PWA is like 167K to download like on disk, which is a huge improvement, especially on lower end devices that don't have as much storage and stuff like that. So it's a much better experience overall, much less costly experience. I think there's a huge opportunity in sort of like line of business apps and like internal apps that companies have to make those PWAs, because then those, like, I don't know about you, but in my role in Microsoft, there are so many things that I have to touch just on a rare occasion, like time and absence reporting or like booking a shuttle or, whatever it is that are kind of like, it would be great if those were apps that were pre-installed with my image of my Windows laptop, right? And so PWAs create that opportunity where you can take this web thing, you can add a few things to it. You add your web app manifest and your service worker, and now all of a sudden you have something that's installable and can basically be ported around and is super light on disk, but gives you direct access to things that you need with intermediate frequency as opposed to needing them every day, and without having to download something huge like some big company portal or something like that. Right.
So what makes something then a progressive web app as opposed to just a regular website?
I mean, I think the distinction is it's largely in sort of the marketing space. The definition that a lot of us have kind of settled on as kind of the minimum viable PWA is running on HTTPS, having a web app manifest that describes all of the meta information about your site and how it should render and all that sort of stuff, and then having a service worker that at least does some basic offline caching. And that would be considered a progressive web app. And that's, in terms of what we're looking at and what we're considering PWAs in the Microsoft sense, that's sort of the definition that we've agreed on. That was what Alex Russell put forward. A couple other folks have basically said, that seems like a good general agreement for what a baseline PWA is. And then there's obviously opportunities to go further, to do things like push notifications if it makes sense, to do synchronization if it makes sense, to do, in our case, integration with OS APIs and stuff like that via WinRT if that makes sense, those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've talked to a lot of different people. We have an Angular podcast, and that was a big thing for a long time, because that comes out of Google as well. Talking about PWAs with Angular. And yeah, nobody really had a great definition for it. So I like having a concise definition. Hey, it has these basic features. And
that's testable too. Testability is a big thing.
Yeah. So what are the advantages of having a PWA? And then I like to just dive into some of the technical details. But I'm aware that some of our listeners are fairly new. And so I kind of want to start with the basics and then we'll move along.
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of advantages, the really big one is the ability to control basically how you react to the network. Because one of the things that I think web development is challenging in more so than other areas of development, certainly than kind of traditional software development, is a lack of control over your execution environment and how your code gets to your users. Because the reality is, like, we can control it up until the point that we respond to your request.
Right.
And then we're at the mercy of the network provider. We're at the mercy of your device, your browser choice, your plugins, any special needs you have, like all of those sorts of things. Like, our control goes completely out the window at that point. So where PWAs really shine is the service worker can effectively be your own personal man in the middle. So you can control all network requests. That means that you can, if the network isn't available, you can respond with an offline page, or you can do things like every network request that's made, make a cached copy of that, and if for some reason the network goes down the next time that page is requested, you can respond from the cache and even let somebody know, hey, this is a stale copy. We'll refresh it as soon as you have network connectivity again. You have also the ability, like I was doing a Q&A last week, and somebody asked what my favorite sort of service worker, like creative service worker recipes were. Dean Hume actually had two of them. The first of which was being able to detect if a browser supports WebP, and if you have WebP versions of all of your images, you can basically take requests for JPEGs and respond with a WebP.
Oh, interesting.
So you switch up which file you're asking for because you have control. You're the man in the middle, right? The other one he did was detecting network speed, and so if you were detected to be on 2G, he would replace all image requests with a response that was an empty gray SVG box that was already stored in the cache. You ended up with kind of a lo-fi experience, and obviously you can have some sort of notification that the reason these images aren't loading is because I'm trying to conserve your bandwidth and get you the content quicker. But those are some really creative things that you can start to do with Service Worker once you tuck into it. And yeah, so the performance benefits there are pretty fantastic. You can get render speeds down really, really low because you don't have to hit the network at all, or you can choose to
you can prioritize things.
Yeah, basically you can figure out what you want to do. Obviously, you'd want to consider using it in combination with things like resource hints and other ways of telling the browser, what servers you're going to be connecting to, what you're going to want.
Right.
But you can do things like preload a bunch of stuff when the service worker is initially installed, so that your cache is basically primed with your CSS and JavaScript that gets used everywhere, images that are always used in the header, that sort of thing, and then kind of you could run from the cache first if the cache has a response, and then you could pull from the network if the network's available to get a new copy for next time, or you could always go to the network first and then cache it offline. And there's so many different patterns for what you can do in terms of that just the performance impact is tremendous. And so you can really get to second loads being almost instantaneous for browsers that support Service Worker, which is pretty much all modern browsers now. So.
Is the Service Worker kind of the star of the show for PWAs then?
In a lot of ways, yeah. Because, there's only so exciting that a JSON file of meta information about your site can get. So, the web app manifest is interesting. I think it's sort of... I'm hopeful that in the future it will become even more interesting, but right now... it's a lot of information about what you want your app's name to be, what you want the icons to be, the start pages, how much UI you want to show, that sort of thing, which is great. There's additions for including things like screenshots and IARC rating and categorizations, which is helpful for a store context. Once we see more folks... IARC. It's like the parental rating.
Okay.
And so... we were looking at those in terms of our store and wanting to allow developers to basically say, I want this to be categorized in these ways.
Right.
So that was a proposal that Microsoft made and landed both that and the IARC rating. And, another one that's in development is like Share 2. So being able to basically identify your PWA as a Share 2 target. So for the share term in Windows for share in Android or what have you, that your PWA, even though it's a web app, it could actually respond to those requests too.
Right.
It's pretty bare bones right now. It's nowhere near as full featured as like the WinRT API for Share 2, but I'm hopeful that might evolve over time as well. Right. It's still not. It's got some basic implementation in Chrome, but nobody else, to my knowledge, has implemented that yet. But I think that Web App Manifest will get more interesting. But Service Worker is definitely the star right now, just because there's so much that you can do with it. You can also completely shoot yourself in the foot with it. That's become more difficult as time has gone on, but there was at one point, I remember when I did my first Service Worker, I had all of my JavaScript files being like super long-lived expiry dates on the server, and so the Service Worker was being cached and not being updated, even though I was pushing updates to the Service Worker. Now the browsers actually will look for a new Service Worker and check to see if it matches the one that they've got on hand already and update it. But yeah, there was a time when we could completely like hose our site by having a bad stale Service Worker sitting around.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm wondering is if the Service Worker sort of intermediates between the browser and I guess the page, the operating system, and the internet. Would it make sense then to essentially have your Service Worker load and then have it load everything else, or?
I don't know that would necessarily make sense. I mean,
because we have these big build systems, right? We have Webpack now, and it kind of squishes everything together.
I mean, there are probably some people that would consider doing something similar to that, but I generally, especially being such a proponent of progressive enhancement and stuff like that, I'm not a really big fan of like the app shell model where you load the header footer and then suck in everything else via AJAX or fetch requests or whatever. I find that method of building very fragile because if anything goes wrong, nothing loads.
Yep. You got nothing.
Yeah. I mean, I remember back to Gawker Media, a number of years ago, they launched their redesign, and they had built this huge JavaScript framework for all of their platforms, which, I mean, they were all blogs. Let's call a spade a spade. It was all blogs or news stuff. It was content, right? It wasn't some rich application, but they built it on top of this JavaScript framework, and everything was being sucked in via AJAX. And when they flipped the switch to turn it on for all those sites, there was a bug in the JavaScript code, and so nothing loaded on any page. Like you got like Lifehacker and like the frame or whatever it was, and then like nothing else inside of it.
Oops.
Yeah. So. Not a huge fan of that approach because I find that sort of thing frustrating. Like if from a user perspective, even if everything works well, but like your boot up time for your JavaScript app is gonna take a bit, especially on a slower device. And so all the time you're waiting for that JavaScript app to boot up is time that somebody can't interact with your site and actually do what they want to do. And so I would rather push a fully baked page and then enhance pieces of it to create a better experience or enhance the whole thing if necessary. But I'd like to get them to being able to do something as quickly as possible.
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of that with, of course, it came out of server rendered, framework setups. So you have Angular Universal or
Fast Boot for Ember. And there's a bunch of them. Yeah,
and so essentially, it loads a fully baked page and then it loads everything on top of it and then captures all the events that came in. And
which is a lot of overhead for most use cases, I think.
Yeah. That's
over-engineered. We tend to do that a lot.
We do.
Yeah.
We like our toys. But I am wondering then, what is kind of the best practice? Or I guess it depends on the app, right, and how much you need. So how do you start deciding, okay, I'm going to pull a Service Worker in and have it help with some of this, and then maybe move on to some of these other more complicated options that we have?
So I think that the folks at Cloud4 actually have a really good post called Progressing Our Progressive Web App or something to that effect, where they actually talk about their evolution of moving their site to being a PWA and then how they evolved their Service Worker over time. I highly recommend that folks read through that, because the neat thing about this is that Service Workers, Web App Manifest, it's all progressive enhancement automatically. Like if you add a Service Worker to your site, it is not going to preclude anybody who doesn't have Service Worker support from being able to use your site. It's an add-on, right? It's just going to make the experience better if somebody can use that. And in a similar way, you can continue to evolve your approach to service worker where, let's say, your first pass, all you want to do is register your service worker and respond with an offline page if a certain request isn't made. That could be your first pass.
Right.
Or maybe you've got that as your first pass. Your second pass becomes that plus pre-caching all of your critical CSS and JavaScript assets, right, and your logo. And then your next step, you determine for a particular section of the site, it makes sense to, like documentation, for instance, to go to cache first and see if you have a cache hit first and respond with the cache, and then if not, go out to the network and cache the response. So you do that for that section. And then for another section that's a little bit more dynamic, you take a different approach. And so you add a specific caching thing for that. And so your service worker grows over time. Right. Like each thing can kind of be bit off one at a time, as opposed to trying to make the leap in. I feel like, as smart as the folks behind Workbox are, the idea, I don't know if you're familiar with Workbox or not, but it's basically a framework for building service workers. Okay. Which feels like overkill to me. I mean, I know that service worker and like fetch and cache, these are all very low level APIs and people love abstraction. Right. But service worker is not so complex that you need to abstract away basic caching stuff and things like that. I feel like that might be a little bit overkill. And I think it's helpful to know how things work under the hood in case things go wrong, which, for your first couple service worker passes, you'll probably make some mistakes. Right. But it's, in the end, you'll have something that's a much more performant experience, a much better user experience overall for your customers. So
that makes sense. So in order to be a PWA, you don't need the push notifications and all the other things.
I don't think anyone's ever going to want a push notification from my blog. I took the first edition of Adaptive Web Design, which is my book on progressive enhancement, and I had done the coding for the original EPUB by hand as well. And so I took all the content of that, I put it up on the web, and then I added a service worker and a web app manifest, and my book is a PWA. And it's static HTML. It's probably never going to change, right? There might be some errata that I'll add or something like that. But if you just want to read the book, when you go to read the book, it loads everything so you can read the entire book offline. You can add it to your homepage, all that sort of stuff.
So what are all of the other options? Because it sounds like there's if I remember, there was a list of like 8 things that you could have on a PWA that...
In terms of like features that you can add to it? I mean, none of them are... I mean, apart from push notifications, which do rely on service worker because that's a network thing, and the periodic sync, which is like a background synchronization piece that relies on service worker, and then there's like a one-off sync as well. But apart from that, all of it's just kind of standard JavaScript APIs that you could use in the context of a PWA or not. I mean, some of them are going to make an app feel more appy, shall we say. So like WebAuthn, for instance, is a relatively new JavaScript standard that allows integration with on-OS biometrics. So Windows Hello via JavaScript, right? Right. And same thing on Android and other stuff like that. And so that's gaining support. Reader, exactly. That's gaining support. And so you could integrate that into your website. It doesn't matter if it's a PWA or not. Right. But it'll make your PWA feel more appy. Right. If that's something that you want to do. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of up to you what features make sense for you, and I think that is going to vary based on the project that you're working on. I did a piece for A List Apart that was called "Yes, That Website Should Be a PWA," that basically details for a bunch of different categories of website type where the benefits are going to be for you most likely. So, if you're an informational site, the caching is probably going to be your biggest thing. Right. If you're a store, then there's going to be the caching, yes, for performance. That's right. Performance is going to be a universal help, right? But then there's going to be things like push notifications. If somebody's done an order, being able to send them updates about that order when it's shipped, what the tracking number is, all that sort of stuff.
New version, whatever.
Yeah, those sorts of things become really useful. As if you're a news site, push notifications could be interesting, but you want to make sure that you're not doing let's say if you're a very frequent publisher, you don't want to send push notifications for everything that you publish. It would be like getting notifications for every tweet in your timeline, right? But you might want to do daily or weekly roll-ups, and you could ask the user what they would prefer to get, and then they could get something that kind of rolls up the top stories or what have you for that day. So a lot of it's about being, I think, honestly, exercising care with the sort of the capabilities that a user is allowing you, like the stuff a user is allowing you to do on their computer, like being cognizant of that and being aware that this is a person you're dealing with, which I don't think we do enough of. There are so many sites that I go to, and like first time I've ever been to the site, and they're immediately like, "Hey, give me your location. Hey, can I send you push notifications? Hey, can I do this?" I'm like, "No, none of that stuff.
Yeah,
you get none of it." And so I think, we need to seem a little less needy. We need to give people context for when things are important and how we intend to use them, and to give users control over how we use them. I think Twitter does a really good job of allowing you to customize how your notifications come in, what you get notified about, all of that sort of stuff. And yeah, but a lot of that stuff could be done with any sort of site. And if you're like a big enterprise site, you may have multiple PWAs within a single domain. And that's kind of a neat thing too, that you can, based on, the subdirectory that you're in, you can have different PWAs in different spots, and they have different service workers that do different things. And
that's interesting.
Act in different scopes and stuff.
So you mentioned subdirectories, but could you also do it for different parts of the page or things like that?
You'd need to be in it's different scopes. Like your service worker has a particular scope that it works in. So if you want it to work for your entire site, it needs to exist in the root folder.
Right.
Whereas if you stored it in your JavaScript folder, it would only be able to operate on the JavaScript folder. You can have multiple service workers that are operating on a given page.
I gotcha.
But they come from different scopes.
Okay.
So if you had one for the root of your site, and then you had one for a particular subdirectory, you may have those two service workers operating both on the same page that's within that subdirectory.
Gotcha. So for example, the application that I've been working on lately is basically a podcast production site. So I could have one for the root site, and then one for podcasters, and then one for even podcasts or episodes or hosts or whatever.
Yep. Yeah. You could do a bunch of independent service workers, and they basically spawn their own worker thread. So.
Right, and then they just do whatever is needed in that area.
Yeah. Obviously, there's a bit more that you need to think about in terms of how they interact with one another.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, I can also see, and this is a lot of times why we create hierarchies and things like that within our code, is because this is a more general concern and this is a more specialized concern.
Yep. Yeah. And you could do some messaging between them as well, doing post message and stuff.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. So just like any worker.
Yep.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
So is there an overall good place for people to become a little more informed about PWAs?
Sure. I mean, there are a bunch of great resources out there. We certainly have some docs on the Windows developer site. The MDN docs, the Mozilla Developer Network docs, are pretty fantastic. Google has some great documentation as well. If folks are looking for great examples of PWA successes, the PWA Stats website and Twitter account are highly recommended. Those are from the folks at Cloud4 as well, and they basically anytime some new stat comes out from a company of what successes they've had with PWA, they end up on the PWA Stats site.
Oh, cool.
And so that's very, very useful for getting ammunition for why you want to do a PWA, convincing your boss.
Yep. So should every website be a PWA?
I think in some capacity, yes. I think we need to be, as with any JavaScript, we need to be cognizant of how we're using it. We don't want to, like, if you are a photographer, you don't want to cache all of the photos on your site on somebody's hard drive, right? Like, you don't want to automatically fill all of that stuff in. We need to be good citizens and good stewards of our stuff that's operating in people's hard drives. But yeah, I think every site out there could benefit from being a PWA in one way or another, if only for performance and offline handling. I don't think anyone's going to install my blog. I don't ever plan on adding push notifications to it. There's no login to it because it's a Jekyll site. It's all static, right?
Somebody should do that anyway.
Yeah. So I'm not gonna do WebAuthn or anything like that because it just doesn't make any sense. But it benefits from being a PWA in terms of performance. I do have some stuff that's going on, like I use web mentions from webmention.io. So I have some JavaScript polling that's going on. I also do some offline caching of that into my Jekyll templates and stuff to speed up performance. But even something like a blog can certainly benefit from being a PWA, a book site, a brochureware, a hotel site. Like, all of those could benefit from being a PWA. Heck, hotel Wi-Fi landing page could really benefit from being a PWA.
Really?
Because Lord knows those performance is horrible in those instances. So
true.
Yep.
So are there new things that are getting added to the list of things that go into a PWA, or new features that people should be looking at coming down the pike?
So one of the features that is relatively new to Service Worker is the background sync. That's still kind of in process. We haven't implemented it yet in Edge. I believe an early version of it does exist in Chromium. I'm not sure how far along it is. I haven't really been tracking that one that closely. I'm sure there are probably some other developments as well that I'm not thinking of right now, but I know I've got some ideas that I'm going to start to push on internally, and then hopefully pitch over to folks at the W3C and such for improvements to the web app manifest and just additional things that would bring some of our stuff that's been proprietary traditionally into a standard space so that other people can take advantage of it too. Like, I think it makes a lot of sense to have dark mode. Like, we have dark mode. macOS has dark mode in Mojave, right?
Yep.
So why not have a media query that actually detects that and allows you to respond? I mean, that's not PWA. It's not specific to Service Worker, but it's something that would be nice to have. So yeah, and I think there's some stuff that start to further blur that line between what is native and what is web, which I think is a good thing.
No, that makes sense. I mean, to the extent that, it could detect a setting in your machine, or, I mean, even just give people the option on the web page, and then the Service Worker goes and says, "Okay, load the dark mode CSS."
Yeah, and I mean, it would be nice to honestly see, like, we have high contrast mode in Windows that we've had for years, and we have media queries for that. It would be nice to see some of that standardized across the board too. Instead of just being proprietary stuff.
Makes sense. How does this play into things like Electron, which runs in Chromium, or Cordova, or even within iOS or Android? Sometimes they just have a little web view in there. Do those need to be PWAs, or?
So again, I think it depends on the product that you're trying to build. I've had a lot of discussions with the folks at Slack about PWA versus Electron, and for them, they want total control over the execution environment. Right. And so Electron gives you that because you know the exact version of Chromium that you're shipping. And so if your desire is to ship the exact same experience in every instance, then Electron can make a lot of sense. Now you're going to pay a premium, and your customers are going to pay a premium for that because they have to download
the entire app.
So they have to download, effectively the Chromium browser for each Electron app that's out there, and they all exist independently and run at their own security speed and all that sort of stuff in terms of updating and that sort of stuff. So you become ultimately responsible for all of that. If you're aware of that and you're willing to shoulder that responsibility, then by all means, go the Electron route if your project actually requires that sort of level of control. But for most instances, like if you can get away with, like if it runs on the web and it runs well on the web and you can add a service worker and stuff like that and have it be able to be installed and have it be able to run offline, Electron's probably overkill for you, right? You don't need that extra overhead, and you could run just fine as a PWA. I think we'll start to see PWAs become that web wrapper thing in app stores, probably, because people do, in many instances for marketing reasons, want to have a presence in an app store. And there's something to be said for that, but they'll effectively be just what we have and what we've had as WebView apps in Android and iOS, what we have as what is effectively a WebView app for PWAs now with like Twitter Lite and stuff like that existing in the Microsoft Store, where it's the WWA host is a wrapper, which is effectively its own instance of Edge running that's isolated and unique to your PWA. But you don't have to carry along all the additional code to run that, right? Which means it ends up being a lot lighter. So I think we'll start to see a lot of folks move to that, but I don't see Electron really going away. I think there'll be a lot of reasons to keep those sorts of tools around. So I think there'll be a divide between those two things, but I feel like PWA gets them closer together, because now all of a sudden you do have more control over the cache and over the network requests and stuff like that that you might have wanted from Electron, but now you get them in both places, right? And to me, the real benefit of PWA is that if you're a company that invests in the development of software, and you are investing in, let's say, an iOS app, an Android app, and a web version of something, and it's all basically providing the same experience, you can double down on your investment in the web and still reach iOS and Android, right? Without having to have a dedicated team for each of those products. If you're not seeing any huge benefits to being native on any platform, really, over being a web app in that platform, then it makes more sense to be a web app, because it's cheaper to build, it's easier to hire for, skills are more portable. Like there's a lot of like cost benefits to being on the web,
and it basically runs everywhere.
Exactly, and you get a lot more bang for your buck. But if there's a reason you need to be closer to the metal, you need to have a richer, faster native experience, then by all means make the investment in having those native applications too. But in a lot of cases, I think the web will basically overtake a certain portion of what have traditionally been native apps.
That makes sense. So I guess the other angle on that is, so within an Electron app, does it make sense to do some of the PWA things?
I think it absolutely does to make sense to have a service worker and that sort of stuff there too.
Yeah. I figured that was the answer, but I didn't want to just take it for granted. So
Yeah. I mean, unless for some reason you need to like lock into an old version of Chromium that doesn't support service worker, which I hope isn't the case because for security reasons. But yeah, I think it absolutely makes sense to do a combined approach, and I think we'll start to see some companies that ship web products that they then also ship in Electron, that they'll take advantage of those PWA things too.
Yeah.
So, and in their case, as with a lot of things, we've thrown a lot of JavaScript code at creating UX affordances and stuff like that, like validation for email fields and URLs and stuff like that. When HTML5 came along and said, hey, here's an email field type and here's a URL field type, now all of a sudden we don't have to ship that code. I feel very much the same way about people who are doing Electron apps and doing caching themselves and pre-caching things and stuff like that. Like, they can get that for free now with Service Worker and not have to maintain that.
Yep, makes sense. Well, if people want to find you online, where are you at?
At Aaron Gustafson, AARONGUSTAFSON. I'm also aaron-gustafson.com. Yeah, those are probably the two best places to find me.
Awesome.
Hey guys, let me tell you about Clubhouse. I swear, I've used every project management software there is out there, and I hated project management software. Now I have Clubhouse. Overall, it's simple and straightforward to use, but has enough of the integrations and power features you need to get the job done without getting confusing. This means that I can use it, and the non-technical members of my team can figure out what they need from it. It also makes it easy for me to zoom out and see what's going on overall before zooming back in and specifying more work that needs to be done, or picking the next task for me to tackle. They integrate with all the systems that you'd expect and have a REST API for, well, the rest.
If you go to https://clubhouse.io/JSJabber, you can get 2 months free instead of the standard 14-day trial for any team size. Once again, that's https://clubhouse.io/JSJabber. All right. Well, we're kind of running out of time. The last segment of the show is picks. Mm-hmm. So do you have some things you want to shout out about on the show?
Oh, gosh. Let's see. So read a book called Homegoing, which is, let's see if I can pronounce her name, Gyasani. I think that's how you pronounce it, which is a fantastic book that actually... It's slavery told through the perspective of the people in Africa whose tribes were enslaved, and how and basically follows two lineages, one in Africa and one that got shipped over to the States, and kind of how generationally they changed over time, and it was
interesting,
incredibly horrifying and moving and beautifully written, and just had a tremendous impact on me. I highly recommend it if folks are looking for a really riveting read. It's hard at some points to get through, but definitely worth reading. That one's pretty fantastic. I'm also a big fan of, don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's Zeitoun, Zeitoun, which was by David Eggers, and it's about a man who stayed behind during Katrina, and it's like a fictionalized biography sort of thing. So it follows a real person, and it's his experiences staying behind during Katrina to take care of the houses that he rents out, and sort of the things that he runs into, and that sort of stuff. That was really interesting. David Eggers has done quite a few books sort of in that genre. What is the What's another fantastic one that follows a Somali boy who escapes being enlisted into child army. Like, I know I'm getting into really like deep, depressing stuff, but I find books like that fascinating and really eye-opening. I like to, I don't know, expand the sphere of my experience,
right?
And so I like to read about things that I have no experience with, in order to, get at least some understanding of the complexity of the human experience.
No, I completely understand, and I mean, even within development, the opportunities that we have to talk to people who have a different experience from us, but yeah, in the broader sense of humanity, right? What kinds of things have people gone through?
Absolutely.
The good and the bad, and really understanding people. It's interesting too, because we see in certain political or religious or other aspects of life, people just demonize other people. And one thing that I see in a lot of this is that 95% of the time, we all want mostly the same thing, just to be happy and live life and things like that.
Take care of our families, take care of ourselves, yeah.
And so, to see where people struggle, and to see what we do to each other, and then to understand that and have a conversation, a real conversation, even if it's painful, about how we can make things better. Yeah. I think that's more powerful than yelling at each other because we don't like what somebody said on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think recognizing our shared humanity is a really important thing. To that end, I actually just went down to Portland for EffectConf, which unfortunately this is the last year of it. But it's a really interesting conference that is very intersectional in how it's a dovetailing of marginalized communities, so people of color and people with disabilities, as well as activism and tech. So it's kind of like this weird blend. It was an extremely emotional 2 days, and it was a lot of listening, and it was a lot of like recognizing my privilege as a cis white male, and just realizing how much we need to listen to each other. How we as software developers can often create scenarios that can be abused by bad actors. So one of the examples that was given in a talk by a woman from GitHub, whose name is totally escaping me because I'm a bit fried from the flight last night, but she was talking about how Venmo had no way to block somebody from being able to send you money. So this woman had an abusive ex-boyfriend who would send her $1 whenever he felt like it, and just berate her in the comment. And so he was using Venmo to abuse her. And they finally cut that off. But there's a lot of times that things like that can happen. Even GitHub had the way they used to do your ability to add somebody to a repository when you created it. So you could create something that was horribly offensive to everybody, and like I could add you to that. And now all of a sudden you're party to this thing that you had no like involvement in or interest in or even knowledge of. So they've changed their ways of doing that so that you can't do that you actually have to accept to be added to a particular project or something. So a lot of times we tend to think of the best case scenario, and we don't always think about how people can use our tools for wrong. And so that was a really eye-opening conference to see how that stuff can be done.
Yeah, and I mean, to a certain degree, I think it's useful to think about, but I also give people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt on some of that stuff because, not the bad actors, but, there's no, I don't know if I was working for Venmo, if I would have ever considered that somebody would send nasty messages to somebody else, right? Yeah. And so, at the same time, I think there is a little bit of grace that we need to offer to people when they don't think of these things, as long as they're willing to...
If they're willing to tackle it. And I think the case that many people are trying to make now is that having a more diverse team building a product will potentially improve your ability to find those oversights ahead of time, because if you've got everybody who's lived basically a very similar experience, they have they all think that because they all agree that this is what they're doing, that like that works for everybody, and when we design with only ourselves and people like us in mind, we exclude everybody else, right?
That's fair.
So I think the more people that we can get involved early on that have, different considerations, different perspectives, different backgrounds, that helps us to create better products. And I think that's one of the things that's made me really happy about working at Microsoft is like our focus. I mean, we still have a long way to go, but our focus on creating a more diverse and inclusive work environment and trying to actually foster more diverse teams and creating space for people to, live their true selves in a work environment and to participate in that. I think is great, and I think our products will be better because of it. So at least I'm hopeful that will be the case. No,
I definitely agree with that. The thing that's interesting there too, and again, it comes back to talking about other people, and if you're okay with this, I'm just going to leave this all in the show, is that I find, and we're going to have to get out of here soonish, but I find that a lot of times we focus on the parts of this that are easy to see, like somebody's race or gender or things like that. And a lot of times, somebody can have a different racial background or gender background than me, but at the same time have a very similar experience growing up. And, and so their background is very similar. And so it's interesting to talk about because sometimes these things that we can see actually, fall into somebody's background, for whatever reason, their gender, their race, whatever, does inform their background, and sometimes it doesn't. And so it's interesting, too, just to talk about, okay, how do we actually figure out which axes of somebody's background matters? And, I guess I just caution people against taking the mental shortcut of somebody looks different, therefore their experience must be different. Go talk to them.
No, absolutely.
Go have the conversation. What's hard for you? What is life like for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I look at, I'm a cis white male. When I was younger, I grew up in a fairly poor household, not like ridiculously poor, but pretty poor. And on the flip side, I've got my son who's 2. He's going to grow up in a much more affluent space than I did, but he's black. And so he is going to grow up, potentially being followed in stores when he goes and walks in on his own. He is going to be immediately the one who's, people are suspicious of and stuff like that. And so he is going to, even though financially and opportunity-wise, he is going to be so much further advanced than I am, there are going to be societal things that are going to, basically be working against him at the same time. And so, it's really interesting where all of these different things intersect. And I think, there are other things like, we've been talking about things that are visible, but in a lot of cases there are disabilities that are invisible. PTSD, for instance, is not something that's glaringly apparent to you that somebody has gone through. And so, how do we build an awareness of issues that people with PTSD struggle with, so that we can make sure that we don't create situations unintentionally, because we're not intending to cause anybody harm.
Right.
But how do we go about creating scenarios where they don't have experience bad situations and stuff like that we don't exacerbate the problems that they're having. And I think a lot of it's just building an awareness is listening and trying to empathize, trying to find our connectedness and our shared humanity. And so that's kind of where I'm at and where I'm putting a lot of my focus now. And I feel like it dovetails nicely with accessibility in kind of a broad sense, and that's kind of where the PWA stuff comes in for me, because it's about creating more opportunities for people to access stuff in broader contexts. And when we start to look towards the rest of the world, they don't always have the best network connectivity, and they don't always have the most modern devices and stuff like that we in the wealthy Western world get. Right. And so the more that we can do to take into account their situations, the better we can make the web overall, because we're creating more opportunities for them to participate and for their voices to be heard and for us to learn more about them. And so it's a cyclical thing, keeps feeding back on itself. And
absolutely. All right. Well, I don't think I have time to do my picks. I'll just shout one out real quick. So I just listened to a book on Audible called Armada, and it's by, what's his name? It's the same guy that wrote Ready Player One, Ernest Cline. And fun book. Not as deep as the ones that you pick, but yeah, I've really enjoyed that. And Audible is just a really terrific way, especially when I'm traveling, to just kind of get some relaxation through the stress of going through the airport and all that garbage. Yep. So anyway, all right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
All right.
It's been a good chat.
Yeah. We'll catch everybody next week.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.